December 2023. A man named Victor Mercado is found dead in his cell on Rikers Island. The official cause, suicide. But those who knew him said he had been pleading for psychiatric care for weeks. His death marks the 12th of that year, 12 men and women who entered the island jail and never left it alive. Rikers Island isn't technically a prison. It's a city jail complex, meant for people awaiting trial or serving short sentences. But to the thousands who cycle through its gates, it feels more like a sovereign nation, a failed state that operates just miles from Manhattan's skyline. A place with its own laws, its own language, its own death toll. This is the story of Rikers Island, America's most notorious jail, but also something far more profound. It's not just a failure of corrections or oversight. Rikers is a geopolitical collapse, a territory of dysfunction that exposes how the American justice system fragments under its own weight. For decades, Rikers has been the embodiment of everything broken in urban governance. Violence without control, bureaucracy without accountability, and reform without results. In this documentary, we'll dissect Rikers as a political entity, a decaying microstate inside a democracy. We'll examine its history, its internal economy, its mechanisms of violence, and the forces that keep it alive, even as every rational actor agrees it should die. Because to understand Rikers is to understand the boundaries of American power, and what happens when the state abandons its own territory. Rikers Island sits on 413 acres of landfill in the East River, between the Bronx and Queens. It's technically part of the Bronx, though accessed only from Queens, an accident of jurisdiction that foreshadows everything about it. Originally purchased in 1884 for $180,000, the island was once farmland. By 1932, it had become the city's main jail site, replacing the crumbling Blackwell's Island Penitentiary. It was named after Abraham Rikers, a Dutch settler from the 17th century, a colonial origin for a colonial institution. Today, Rikers is a labyrinth of 10 separate jails, some for men, one for women, others for adolescents. Each has a bureaucratic title: the Anna M. Cross Center, the George R. Vierno Center, the Eric M. Taylor Center. But inside they're known by their nicknames: the Bing, the Boat, the Tombs. The architecture is telling: brutalist concrete blocks, fluorescent lit corridors, no natural air. Every detail communicates containment, not correction. At its peak in the 1990s, Rikers held over 20,000 inmates. That number has fallen to around 6,000, but the violence has not. Each year, hundreds of stabbings and slashings occur. Officers call out sick en masse. Gangs control entire dorms. The jail operates like a failed city-state with its own hierarchies. Correctional officers function as a paramilitary class, shielded by powerful unions like the Correction Officers Benevolent Association, COBA. Inside, inmates organize along racial and gang lines: Bloods, Crips, Trinitarios, and local sets with shifting alliances. Everyone knows the rules. But the rules aren't written. A 2014 Department of Justice report described Rikers as having a culture of violence so pervasive that brutality was routine and accepted. In some facilities, officers would intentionally allow fights between inmates, then punish survivors for disobedience. The DOJ concluded that conditions at Rikers violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. But enforcement proved elusive, because in practice Rikers is a government that governs itself. Rikers' decay is not an accident, it's the inevitable outcome of a system built to warehouse the poor. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, New York City's tough-on-crime policies flooded Rikers with thousands of detainees who were legally presumed innocent. The jail became a dumping ground for the mentally ill, the homeless, and the addicted, people awaiting trial for months, sometimes years, because they couldn't afford bail. The 1990s also saw the introduction of punitive control units, the most infamous being the Central Punitive Segregation Unit, known as the Bing. It was solitary confinement on an industrial scale, with over 1,000 people in isolation at its peak. By the early 2000s, Rikers wasn't just overcrowded, it was overrun. And the city's response was not reform, but containment. Rikers functions on a paradox. The more chaotic it becomes, the more its existence is justified. The system depends on disorder to sustain its funding, its staffing, and its political relevance. Officers claim the jail is too dangerous to cut staff. Reformers claim it's too violent to remain open. Meanwhile, detainees die at record rates. In 2022, the New York Times reported that guards routinely abandoned posts, leaving dorms unsupervised for hours. In one case, an inmate named Michael Tyson, no relation to the boxer, was beaten to death in an unsupervised cell. His death was recorded on surveillance cameras. No one intervened. A federal monitor overseeing Rikers under a 2015 consent decree has repeatedly warned that the Department of Correction lacks the basic capacity to control the jails. By 2023, the monitor concluded that Rikers Island is in a state of crisis. Violence at Rikers is not a symptom. It's a method of governance. Rikers is nominally managed by the New York City Department of Correction, under the authority of the mayor. But every attempt to impose order has drowned in bureaucratic inertia. Mayors from Ed Koch to Eric Adams have promised reform. Each announced new oversight bodies, new training programs, new modernization efforts. Yet none have dismantled the core structure, a self-perpetuating cycle of violence, paperwork, and political protection. A 2021 report from the City Council Oversight Committee found that nearly 30% of uniformed correctional staff were out sick or on modified duty at any given time. This created a cascading failure. With fewer officers available, detainees were locked in cells for 23 hours a day, conditions that fueled riots, injuries, and suicides. Even the medical system has collapsed. In 2022, the city's Department of Health and Mental Hygiene confirmed that multiple inmates died waiting for emergency care. One man, Elijah Muhammad, died of a diabetic seizure after officers ignored his pleas for insulin. Every layer of administration claims plausible deniability. The result is governance by absence, a state that exists only on paper. To understand why Rikers persists, follow the money. Rikers cost the city roughly $556,000 per inmate per year, one of the highest incarceration costs in the world. Yet the physical conditions resemble a war zone. Collapsing ceilings, black mold, infestations. The explanation lies in political economy. COBA, the Correction Officers Union, wields enormous influence. Its members earn generous overtime pay, some make over $300,000 annually. Every fight, every emergency, every security incident translates into more hours, more pay, more leverage. Meanwhile, billions in contracts flow to private vendors for food, maintenance, and medical services. The system's dysfunction is not a bug, it's an economy. No discussion of Rikers is complete without the story of Khalif Browder. In 2010, the 16-year-old from the Bronx was arrested for allegedly stealing a backpack. Unable to afford $3,000 bail, he spent 3 years at Rikers awaiting trial, 2 of them in solitary confinement. He was never convicted of any crime. Surveillance footage later showed Browder being assaulted by guards and fellow inmates. After his release, he described Rikers as hell on earth. In 2015, he took his own life. Browder's case sparked public outrage and renewed calls to close the island. But 10 years later, the jail remains open, and the deaths continue. Khalif's story wasn't an anomaly. It was the blueprint. Since 2015, Rikers has been under federal monitoring as part of a settlement in Nunez v. City of New York, a class-action lawsuit alleging systemic brutality. But federal monitors can only observe. They cannot govern. In 2023, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Damian Williams, took the unprecedented step of seeking federal receivership, a legal move to remove Rikers from city control entirely. Williams stated bluntly, "The city has proven it cannot manage Rikers Island." If approved, it would mark the first time a major American jail was placed under direct federal control. A recognition that, in effect, a part of New York City has seceded from governance. Rikers is not just a failing institution, it's an autonomous territory of decay. Political theorists define a failed state as one that can no longer enforce laws, protect citizens, or maintain legitimacy. By those standards, Rikers Island meets every criterion. It has borders, factions, economies, and a monopoly on violence, just not by the state. Inside, sovereignty belongs to whoever can survive the night. To those who study mass incarceration, Rikers represents the internal frontier of American governance, a territory of exception where constitutional rights are suspended and forgotten. Legal scholar Bernard Harcourt once described it as a zone of indistinction, where people are not citizens but subjects. And yet, every year tens of thousands of New Yorkers pass through it, most of them poor, most of them black or Latino, most awaiting trial. For many, Rikers is their first encounter with the justice system. It tells them exactly what justice means. The city's current plan, called Close Rikers, was approved in 2019. It promises to shutter the island by 2027 and replace it with 4 smaller borough-based jails. But construction delays, political backlash, and rising crime rhetoric have stalled progress. Mayor Eric Adams, himself a former NYPD officer, has expressed skepticism about the plan. Meanwhile, the population at Rikers continues to grow. Experts warn that without drastic intervention, closure may be impossible. In the words of one city official, Rikers doesn't die easily. It's built to survive chaos. The island has become a living fossil, a monument to every failed promise of criminal justice reform in America. Rikers Island is not an anomaly, it's a mirror. It reflects the fractured logic of a nation that criminalizes poverty and calls it justice. It shows how bureaucracies can become states unto themselves, unaccountable, unelected, and untouchable. It reveals the limits of democracy when it comes to its most marginalized citizens. If the rule of law cannot reach the jails that bear its name, then where does it still rule? Perhaps that's the true horror of Rikers. Not just that people die there, but that the state itself ceases to exist inside its walls. If a government loses control of 1 square mile of land, does it still govern that land? And if it loses control of thousands of lives within that space, does it still govern at all? Rikers Island isn't just a failure of incarceration. It's the map of a nation's moral collapse. Thank you for watching. The search for truth continues.